Today's topic is 120 years of Vedanta in America. In the history of political thoughts and human civilizations, America is sometimes looked upon as a unique socio-political experiment. A group of pilgrims left England in search of religious liberty in 1520, and they wanted to create a nation built upon Puritan or Calvinist principles. The stern, unforgiving, and heavy laden with sin and little hope of redemption, unless you belong to one particular sect, you conformed to a set doctrines and dogmas. Now, that nation has become a unique socio-political experiment built upon liberty, equality, and egalitarian spirits. The land of American dreams, which keeps its doors and windows open to all new ideas coming from any part of the world, ready to experiment, ready to practice, and ready to innovate new ideas. Now, in the history of this nation, something happened in the last decade of 19th century. In fact, till the last decade of 19th century, this aspiration for building a nation based on Puritan principles continued, but it had to face many challenges, mostly coming from the European continent. Darwinism, Marxism, socialism, communism, and positivism, so many different thought currents, all challenging most of the Puritan principles, the Calvinist principles, upon which this nation was built in 16th century. So America was at crossroads in the last decade of 19th century, because the old spirit of Greco-Roman tradition, the spirit of reason, the spirit of questioning, and the spirit of rational analysis suddenly emerged. But at the same time, there was no satisfactory answer, no reconciliation. On the one hand, the uniqueness claims, the exclusivistic claims of monotheistic religious tradition, the church, and the established religious hierarchy were challenged by new ideas, new philosophical doctrines like positivism, and also new radical ideas of social transformation, mostly after the publication of Das Kapital and Communist Manifesto. So as I said, on the one hand, the old aspiration of Calvinism, the aspiration with which the Pilgrim Fathers came here to build a nation exclusively built upon the Puritan Calvinistic principles, absolutely uncompromising do's and don'ts, those aspirations remained strong. At the same time, there was a challenge from modern thought currents, not only from Europe, but also within this country. The universalism of Unitarian Church, the Theosophical movement, which had its origin in New York, the commercial capital of this country. So all these posed new challenges and new questions before the highly hierarchical, dogmatic theology. It was during this period, maybe at the peak of this period, that is in 1893, that a parliament of religion was held as part of the Columbian Exposition, the 400th anniversary of Columbus' discovery of this country. And in that parliament of religion, which originally was planned to salvage the old exclusivistic Calvinistic principles of the church, that religion rather became a way to come out of this exclusivism indirectly. Because in that parliament of religion, a monk coming from India told for the first time, made this proclamation for the first time in this country, that every religion is equally valid. If the seeker is sincere and honest, every religion is an equally acceptable path leading to spiritual destination, to salvation or redemption or liberation, whatever you may call it. And every prophet, every religious teacher is to be honored, accepted and respected. Not just tolerated, but accepted as an authority on spiritual matters. Now this was a total revolution. In fact, this was the beginning of a new religious paradigm in the history of religious thought. And ever since that event, that is in 1893, the Parliament of Religion, ever since that event, this nation is directly and indirectly going through a process of expansion, opening up, becoming more and more tolerant and more universal. We have to remember one important point. The transformation of a society or a nation should not be judged on the number of Vedanta societies in America or the number of preachers, but these influences work through subtle channels. Not only the external practices of yoga, but the subtle opening up of human minds and human thinking. Today, for example, interreligious dialogue, interfaith action, interspirituality movement, all these are becoming popular. Could you imagine such a thing happening unless somebody in 1893 gave a new definition to religion, who defined religion as spirituality? Religion goes beyond religions. True religion, that is capital letter R, is something that goes beyond religious traditions established by prophets and saints and sages. They all try to interpret the supreme religion, that is spirituality, in their own respective languages and traditions. One supreme spiritual truth which teaches us that existence is one, creation is one, humanity is a single spiritual family, humanity is essentially a single existence. This idea is taught and interpreted by different prophets and different saints and sages born in different countries to different cultural traditions. So when they expound these universal truths, very often their language may differ depending upon the culture, the vocabulary of the culture to which they are born, the language which they use. and also the historical past of the particular society in which they happen to be born. Depending upon all these secondary factors, the language and vocabulary of a prophet may change, but the central teaching of all great religious traditions, all great religious prophets, is the spiritual oneness of existence. Swami Vivekananda gave this new interpretation. It was practically much more radical, much more revolutionary than perhaps the socio-economic political theories of Marx or Engels. Because this kind of radical thinking goes very deep. Its impact should not be judged based upon its impact on the people who lived in those times. A few prominent American thinkers like Schellinger, who was practically suffering from depression, scientists like Tesla, psychologists like William James, they were all profoundly influenced by Swamiji's new ideas. But going beyond all that, it opened up a new royal highway through which Eastern wisdom started flowing towards America. The later popularity of Zen Buddhism, different meditative practices, yogic practices, the idea of a universal approach in religious faith, the idea that all religious teachers can come together and discuss, the idea of universal religious harmony, all these stemmed out of Swami Vivekananda's concept of universal religion. Now, to give the full background of Swamiji's new interpretation of Vedanta or universal religion, we have to go back a little and find out how Swami Vivekananda built the lost bridges that connected the East with West in ancient times. If you look at the history of ancient Greece, you find almost right from 6th or 5th century BC, that means when Heraclitus was living in Greece and Buddha was preaching his spiritual ideas in India. Right from 6th century onwards, there was a close link between ancient Greece and ancient India. But that was not very vigorous, mostly indirectly, because Persians used to visit India and they used to carry many ideas of Eastern spiritual wisdom to Alexandria and also directly to Greece. After Darius conquered many parts of Greece, and till the Peloponnesian War, in which the Persians, 300 Persians crushed a huge Persian army, till the famous war, Peloponnesian War, there was constant contact between Persia, ancient Persia, Athens and Sparta in Greece. And later on, after Alexander's advent in the northwestern borders of India, this link became much more productive, and large number of philosophers and saints used to travel between these. That's why you find many similarities among the teachings of the great Thales, Thales of Nineveh, belonged to 7th century BC, and the ancient Sankhya philosophical ideas of Hinduism. Incidentally, Nikola Tesla was highly impressed. He was stunned when he heard from Swami Vivekananda an exposition of Sankhya philosophy, which tells you that both time and space, energy and matter, they all emerge from one central principle, which Sankhya is called Pradhanam of Prakriti. He could not live long enough to scientifically prove that theory. Anyhow, that's a different matter. Now, And for a long time, especially after the Augustinian theology became very prominent, philosophy practically died in Western world. And after that, till about 16th century or 17th century, there was no connection between, there was no spiritual or cultural link between the ancient India and Western world. So in 1567, a few important Vedantic texts were for the first time translated from classical Sanskrit into Persian. It was accomplished due to the efforts of a great Muslim ruler in India. His name was Dara Shikoh. He was a great, he believed in what we now call universal religious harmony. So he used to hold discussions in his court. He used to invite Christian Portuguese missionaries from Goa to his court in Delhi. And he used to invite a large number of Sanskrit Pandits, and he used to invite Muslims, Sufis and others. And used to hold interreligious discussions in his court. So he requested a group of scholars who knew both Sanskrit and Persian to translate 50 of these Upanishads into Persian. In fact, these 50 Upanishads were later translated by Paul Deussen into German in 19th century, and he added 10 more Upanishads. So those volumes are still available. English translations of Paul Deusen's German translation of 60 Upanishads, so to speak. Now, going further backward, you find in 1567, 50 of these prominent Vedantic texts were translated for the first time from Sanskrit into Persian. And in 1801, a famous French scholar, Anquetil Duperreau, translated these Upanishads from Persian into Latin. Many great thinkers of Europe happened to read these Upanishads translations in Latin, original Latin. And many of them were prominent theologians and Christian divines teaching the monasteries of Europe. And Schopenhauer was one of them. Not only Schopenhauer, many of the Victorian romantic poets, Percy Shelley, Keats, Wordsworth, also happened to read some of these translations which appeared in fragments in some English magazines. And in 19th century, the great transcendentalists, Emerson, Thoreau, Whitman, and many others happened to read the writings, or they were influenced by the writings of Schopenhauer. That's why you find in the first edition of the Bible of Christian Science, Mary Baker Eddy's first edition, I read somewhere, I don't know whether the first edition work is available or not. In the first edition of the prominent work, which is the Bible of Christian Science, there were several quotations and references to Upanishads and Gita. But they removed all these in the subsequent editions because they wanted to make it something totally independent. Now, what I want to tell you was, the link already existed in ancient times. But in 19th century, towards the end of 19th century, Swami Vivekananda gave an entirely new interpretation. Because Swami Vivekananda interpreted Vedanta in the language of modern man. The language of modern man living in the age of science and technology. And he interpreted this not as a separate religion or a separate religious doctrine, but as a spiritual ideal which goes beyond all religions, but at the same time accommodating all religious traditions and the teachings of all great prophets. So he said, true religion is spirituality. And this spiritual content is present in all religious traditions. That's why today we have got inter-spirituality movement. Because many religious traditions, which formerly were fighting with one another, now recognize that there is a spiritual content in all religious traditions, irrespective of differences in terms of culture, tradition, and so on. I was just trying to give a brief account of the background and the evolution of this ancient link between the East and West, the spiritual link that existed between East and West. Now, Swami Vivekananda once said, I am an instrument and he is the operator. Through this instrument, he is rousing the religious instinct in thousands of hearts in this far-off country. It is his will and I am a voice without a form. So Swamiji's first mission in this country was to teach inter-religious harmony. And while teaching this inter-religious harmony, he emphasized one important point. True religion is not opposed to science and reason. As I said earlier, the old Puritan Calvinism that was established by the Pilgrim Fathers here was facing a great challenge, because in ancient times Romans and Greeks believed in reason and they believed in questioning. So this ancient Greek spirit suddenly re-emerged because they believed in the primacy of reason. So when people started analyzing the authenticity of dogmatic religious traditions through the eyes of reason, they found there was so much that is wanting in this hierarchical religious tradition. There is a famous poem attributed to Matthew Arnold. He wrote this in 1867, less than 3 decades before Swami Vivekananda defined religion as spirituality. The sea of faith was once too at the full and round earth's shore, lay like the folds of a bright girdle furled, but now I only hear its melancholy, long, withdrawing roar. He says, the sea of religion is now weeping and crying. That's what he's saying, melancholy. Because it could not face the onslaughts of science and technology, humanism and reason. Of the right wind, down the vast edges, dear a naked shingles world. Now, Swamiji had a special affection for this country. And therefore, he thought America is in many ways an appropriate place, a most appropriate place to preach Vedanta. It had its own shortcomings, market orientation, profit orientation, and so on. But at the same time, behind all this, there is a strong spirit of independence and freedom. So Swamiji himself said, referring to America, Swamiji wrote to Alasinga Perumal. He was one of his disciples. Here is a grand field. What have I to do with this ism or that ism? I am the servant of the Lord. Where on earth is there a better field than here for propagating all high ideas? Here where man feels for man and women are goddesses. The idea is this. Swamiji was coming from India. Now, the problem with India was, It had already gone through its golden eras in ancient times. If you look at Indian history, you find, according to modern historians, both Western and Eastern, India had gone through almost 19 centuries of golden era. But you have to think it started thousands of years before Jesus. Its cultural evolution began thousands of years before Jesus was born. But over the years, in spite of great spiritual, philosophical and religious tradition, many social injustices, many social problems crept into society. Casteism, untouchability and so on. In fact, one of Swami Vivekananda's mission was to point his finger directly at the problems of Indian society and to prescribe appropriate medicines, as a doctor prescribes medicines for a patient. In fact, Mahatma Gandhi's movement against casteism and untouchability and his struggles against social injustices all were inspired by Swami Vivekananda's words, as he himself acknowledged several times. All the great social movements which began in India in the early decades of 20th century had their origin in Vivekananda's teachings. Not only Mahatma Gandhi, Ambedkar and several Sri Narayana Guru and several others all over India. That's a different matter. So Swamiji had a great admiration for India's great spiritual tradition. But at the same time, he was a little worried, he was upset by some of the problems at the social level. They were not religious problems, they were social problems, social inadequacies, divisive tendencies, social injustices, neglect of the women folk, neglect of a large number of people in education and upliftment, and so on. So Swamiji came to this country, and here he found altogether a new society where all were practically equal. Of course, we have to remember this was long before Martin Luther King made his appearance. So we should remember that even when Swamiji uttered these words, there were social problems here like racism and so on, discrimination. These things did exist. But still, the society was mobile. It was moving forward. That is how they could abolish all these social problems in later decades. So, Swamiji was highly impressed by the democratic spirit, the spirit of liberality, freedom. And now, the message that he gave to the Western world was Vedanta. And Vedanta is nothing but the message of freedom, the message of spiritual freedom, ultimate spiritual freedom. Because Vedanta teaches us that freedom given to senses leads to spiritual slavery. Freedom from the tyranny of senses leads to spiritual liberation. As Swamiji pointed out, though there was a strong spirit of freedom and liberality in this country, very often that freedom was interpreted not in a spiritual sense, but in a purely material sense. If that freedom can be elevated to a higher level, along with freedom from poverty, freedom from backwardness, freedom from illiteracy, freedom from ignorance, freedom from social injustices. Along with that freedom, if we can also teach these people the path to freedom at the spiritual level, path to spiritual freedom, then there cannot be a better field than America to preach Vedanta. That was his idea. But this should be understood, that the freedom that Swami Vivekananda taught and preached was not a freedom as we understand it in the material sense. Because that freedom has got one danger. That freedom sometimes gets us stuck to the material plane. We become blind to the truth that we have to move forward. So Swamiji also refers to that problem. So in one context, Swamiji says in his 1897 Lahore address, Swami Vivekananda made an interesting declaration that modern science is pulverizing the porcelain foundation of all dualistic religions everywhere. He refers to America. Not only here, not only in India, but it still much more so in Europe and America. And even there is something of this idea of Advaita, the idea of oneness. After all, democracy is nothing but the concept of political and social unity, oneness, equality. Advaita is nothing but oneness and equality at the spiritual sense. So along with this idea of equality in the political and social sense, if we can give to this country the idea of spiritual equality, then there cannot be a better field than America for preaching Vedanta. That was his idea. But even there in America, there is something of this idea of Advaita. And it will have to go from India. It has already got there. It will have to grow and increase and save their civilizations too. For in the West, the older order of things is vanishing, is referring to the challenges that the church was facing in Western world. Islam had not figured much in Swami Vivekananda's horizon, because it still remained more or less in its primitive phase of evolution. But Christianity had inherited a unique Greco-Roman culture of reason and rational analysis. In spite of all that Augustine did, or Aquinas did, or Constantine tried to do earlier, Western man and women still has something of the old Greek heritage dormant within. That's what Swamiji is referring to. So he says, for in the West, the old order of things is vanishing, giving way to a new order of things, which is the worship of gold, the worship of mammon. I mean, there was a movement away from the clutches of theocracy, but it was moving towards mammon. Thus, this old crude system of religion was better than the modern system, namely competition and gold. But that is not enough. Along with this, we have to teach them the Advaita, and this, therefore, to preach the Advaita to everyone, so that religion may withstand the shock of modern science. So, religion can withstand the shock of modern science only if it is preached in the language of Advaita. That's Swamiji's idea. Swamiji was emphatic on this point, because Western spirit believes in the equality, social and political equality, equality of opportunities, scope for everyone. But this equality is often interpreted in narrow materialistic terms. This should be there. This should not be replaced. But it is inadequate. Along with this democratic idea of equality and equal opportunity to everyone, we should also teach them the idea that spiritually creation, humanity is one. There is a higher spiritual aspiration of unity and equality. That is Advaita. The idea that all religions are equally valid paths leading to the same goal. God is not one who creates this world and sits outside of it. God is the indweller, the immanent reality present in all beings. And our goal is to bring out this inherent divinity. That's why he defined religion as a manifestation of divinity already in man. It's a radical change. Religion is not faith. Religion is not just going to places of worship. Religion is not confessing our problems to an intermediary who stands between us and God, or a priest who prays on our behalf, who worships on our behalf, in a temple or a church or a synagogue or mosque, wherever it is. Religion is the manifestation of this inherent inner divine principle, which is present in all. So this is a kind of spiritual democracy which goes far beyond the political and social democracy as understood in modern political thoughts. That's what Swamiji's idea. That's why he emphasized that Advaita should be linked to this socio-political concept of equality. Because Advaita is the concept of spiritual equality. Democracy is the concept of political and social equality. So opportunity is there for everyone, not only in a political democracy, but also in a spiritual democracy, because everyone can and should strive to bring out this inner divine principle. And this is possible for all. Now, this is a kind of universal spiritual humanism, which goes far beyond any other kind of humanism that we have ever studied or thought about. Because it is universal in the sense it accepts all humanity as one spiritual fraternity. And again, it doesn't recognize the boundaries of nation, culture, race, religion, or anything. Even people who do not have any religious faith, people who reject religion, can be spiritual in this sense, because even he or she could bring out this inner divinity. For bringing out this inner divinity, all that we need to do is to practice unselfishness, compassion, broad-mindedness, and love for the whole humanity. You need not sign under the dotted line, well, I believe in God. No, God doesn't bother whether you believe in Him or not. God only bothers whether you practice this universal spiritual humanism. That was Swami Vivekananda's idea. This would be acceptable even to non-believers, atheists and agnostics. That's why when religious tradition was facing challenges in Western world from radical humanists who accused religion of being anti-humanistic, and from positivists who accused religion as being against the spirit of modern reasoning, and also scientists, and also the followers of Darwin, who said the idea of creation explained the Genesis, doesn't conform to the realities of modern scientific discoveries. So Swamiji said, true religion is spirituality, and this spirituality is nothing but looking upon the entire creation as one spiritual entity, not recognizing boundaries of religion, nation, culture, language, or race, or anything. That's why, as I mentioned on a few occasions earlier, maybe one of the greatest spiritual personalities the world had produced did not affirm his faith in God. He was Buddha. And there was an equally great religious teacher in India. In fact, his philosophy is considered to be one of the atheistic systems, Jaina religion. In fact, Mahatma Gandhi got his ahimsa ideal from the Jaina religion. It got reabsorbed in Hindu religious tradition. Now, it doesn't have a separate existence as such, because it was just this offspring of Hindu religious tradition. This idea of ahimsa, which was already present there in Hindu religious tradition, was emphasized by Vardhamana Mahavira, who was a contemporary of Buddha, elder contemporary of Buddha, about 25 years older than Buddha he was. He was also a prince who was born as a prince, a king who renounced everything and went to a cave and and spent his time meditating there. who did not believe in a God. And he is supposed to be one of the greatest spiritual personalities. So one can be spiritual if he has a universal, broad-minded, compassionate outlook towards others. But this is not based on what we understand normally by the term humanism. It is based upon the realization of the presence of a universal spirit in all beings, which Swamiji called Advaita, or the idea of spiritual democracy. So if we can put spiritual democracy and political democracy together, it will become an ideal nation, an ideal society. So of course a remote dream. It's difficult to bring people from the clutches of mammon. Not easy. No? So now I shall refer to a few more important points. Just to give an idea of the impact of Vivekananda's teachings. I don't say that these things would not have happened if Swami Vivekananda had not come to this country. What I want to tell you, historically and accidentally, Swami Vivekananda happened to be the instrument in bringing about many of these ideas, and in contributing to their prominence in our own times. So, a recent survey, it's an article, it's a reference. A recent survey in America found that 65% of Americans say Christians, Jews, Muslims, and Buddhists all pray to the same God, although called by different names. What is this? Nothing but Indram Mitram Varunam Agnirahu Atho Divyasa Suparno Garutman Ekam Sat Vipra Bagudha Vadanti Agnim Yamam Matarishwanamahu. I was just quoting a verse from Rigveda that at least belonged 4th millennium BC. It says, this verse gives you a list of the different deities whom ancient Aryans used to worship in ancient India. Indra, Mitra, Varuna, Agni, Rahu. They called them Indra, Mitra, Varuna, Agni. You may call in modern times, you may call the names of different godhead in different organized religions. These are all names which people used to call their names, their ideas of absolute reality. This is a quotation, what I'm quoting now is a quotation from Los Angeles Times, September 7, 1991. God is the same in all religions. That's the article. So this article says, actually the article is reproducing a statement from Rigveda Samhita. That's the interesting part. 65% of Americans say Christians, Jews, Muslims, and Buddhists all pray to the same God, although called by different names. The same poll noted that 2 out of every 3 adults believe that it doesn't matter what God or higher power you pray to, because that universal force will respond regardless. Now, when I had occasion to interact with some of new generation Americans, high school students on 2-3 occasions here, it's something very interesting, Unconsciously, a whole nation is moving from Calvinistic Puritanism towards universal religion, right from 1893 onwards. Of course, we have to remember, when Swami Vivekananda appeared here, the ground was already ready. We should not forget the great contributions of the Transcendentalists. We should not forget the contributions of Emerson, Thoreau, Whitman, and the others, who were inspired by the writings of Schopenhauer, who got it from the Upanishads. And we should not say that this idea of spiritual kinship between different religious traditions is an essentially new contribution of Vivekananda. Swami Vivekananda would be the first person to deny that, because he always said again and again, I preach nothing but the Upanishads. And these Upanishads were translated from Persian into Latin in 1801 by a French scholar. Again, they were translated by Hendrik into German towards the end of 19th century. And many of them were translated by the Theosophical Society, who published in 1896 or 97. That's why Swami Vivekananda wrote to Swami Ramakrishna Order, there is no end of work here. Wherever the seed of his power means the power of Lord, will fall, there it will fructify, be it today or in 100 years. That is Swamiji's own prophecy. He says, this power will never be lost. It will fructify. So, today if you go to universities and schools, you find Hindu chaplains, not only Jewish rabbis or Christian ministers. You find chaplains teaching Vedanta. Even in American military, you find chaplains, non-Christian, non-Jewish traditions. Perhaps this would not have been possible but for this idea of universal religious tradition which Swami Vivekananda brought to this country in 1893. As I said earlier, Swamiji would be the first one to deny that he was exclusively responsible for this idea. As I said, this idea was already here, but it had not become a powerful thought movement. It had not received an authentic interpretation from an authentic spiritual seer. And Vivekananda did not preach as a professor or a preacher, but he preached and taught as a saint who had experienced what he was preaching. So that authenticity was lacking till the advent of Vivekananda. That made all the difference. Thank you. Namaskar.